If you're planning to have any sort of visual effects in your next film, then this episode is for you. We'll be discussing many important things to consider if you're going to be using visual effects, as well as some terminology that you should definitely know. Whether you're directing, producing, DPing, or writing, it is important to have a good understanding of how visual effects shots get accomplished. Do note that this is not a visual effects how-to tutorial, but instead it is more of an opportunity for directors, producers, writers, DPs, and anyone else who's interested to gain an understanding into the visual effects world and how it applies to your job, as well as a few things to keep in mind and consider when it comes to planning for, preparing for, budgeting, and shooting visual effects shots or working with visual effects elements in your own projects. Maybe you're pretty good with visual effects and graphic stuff on your own, and you plan on doing all the visual effects yourself. That's great. But for many filmmakers out there, myself included, it's usually much better and going to look so much cooler if we simply focus on what we're good at and instead find someone else to do the visual effects. Whether it's a friend who's really good at visual effects that's helping you out for free or for low cost on a really low budget or small project, or maybe it's a visual effects artist or visual effects team that you hire for your project. As a writer, it is important for you to have a good understanding of what goes into VFX elements and how they are accomplished. This way, you'll have a much better expectation of what can be accomplished when you're writing something. As a director, producer, or DP, it's important for you to have an understanding of visual effects so that you know what it takes to plan and prepare for and shoot those shots or anything that requires a VFX element, as well as the cost involved for different types of VFX work. This will help you to have a much more realistic expectation of what can actually be done, as well as helping you to plan your shots accordingly, which will hopefully help you to get better results with your visual effects and help you to minimize unnecessary work, which in turn will usually minimize unnecessary costs. Of course, in the VFX world, just about anything can be done. Don't limit your creativity, think outside the box, try something fresh and new. However, just because anything can be done, it doesn't mean that anything is going to be cheap or within your budget. VFX are usually only limited by two things: your imagination and your budget. By the way, if you're looking for a visual effects artist for an upcoming project that you have, I would highly recommend checking out a site called Upwork. It is a site where you can hire freelancers. On a short film that I did a few years ago, I found a VFX artist on Upwork and hired him to do a couple VFX shots for that short, and I actually ended up using the same artist for all of my other projects since then. If you're familiar with Fiverr, Upwork is similar to Fiverr, but I've personally been much happier with the quality of freelancers available on Upwork. And by the way, shout out to Neil, the VFX artist who has done a lot of VFX work on a lot of my projects. He's a really talented artist, and if you're looking for great VFX work, I'm not sure how busy Neil is, but I would highly recommend that you check him out. Hit him up, ask him what he would charge. Yes, he does cost money, so please don't ask him to do it for free, but he's worth it. I'll include a link to his Upwork profile in the description below. And no, I did not get paid or receive anything to say anything that I just said about Neil or Upwork or anything else. If you plan on incorporating VFX into your next film, then it really helps to have a good understanding of the VFX jargon. If you don't have experience with VFX, then learning these things will help you to have a better idea of what can be achieved and how much it will cost. It will also help you to plan your shots accordingly and better communicate your goals with your team. In order to pull off VFX, there are certain ways that you must shoot certain things based on what sort of VFX elements you're going to be using. So having a good understanding of how these VFX elements work and what they are and what sort of elements you require for each shot is going to help you to do a much better job of getting the right shots the first time around and not have to go back and reshoot something or spend a whole lot extra money doing a different type of VFX. The word comp is short for composite or compositing, depending on which way you're using it. In the VFX world, when you integrate computer-generated graphics into a real-world shot, or when you mesh multiple shots together to make them look like one seamless or continuous shot, this is called compositing. your end result becomes a composite or a composite image or just simply a comp. Replacing a green screen with a CG background or with a real-world background is compositing. Also, placing a CG element on top of an existing real-world frame is also compositing. Compositing is a pretty widely used job in the VFX world, and just about every VFX shot that you see is going to require some sort of compositing. That's how you actually mesh the elements together. And so from a budgeting perspective, when you're putting together a budget and you get a quote from your VFX artist and you see that every single shot has a compositing line item listed on it, yes, that's a real thing. That's how they actually combine the elements to form a single seamless image. And yes, every shot is going to require its own flavor of compositing because every shot is different. Anytime the angle or the focal length or the aperture or the lighting or anything else is different, it's going to require different layers of work in order to accomplish that comp. CG stands for computer generated. And so a CG asset or a CG element is simply any sort of computer-generated graphic, usually some sort of 3D model or 3D asset or 3D element, which is then comped into a shot. For example, if you're filming a scene with a real prop torch, but you don't want to have a live flame there, hopefully you have some practical lighting effects though to make it look like there's a flame on the face of whoever's carrying the torch, adding in a CG flame, that would be a 3D flame asset or a CG asset, which you would then add into that shot. Plate shots are shots that you actually film with a crew or with a small unit, but it's a real-world shot that you end up using in the background of a CG or VFX shot in some way. So whether you're filming a plate shot that'll be used to replace a green screen, or you're filming a plate shot to put behind an element, whatever that is, a plate shot is a shot that you're actually shooting yourself, and it's usually used as the background of either a scene or some sort of VFX shot or element that you're gonna have in your film. So to give you an example of plate shots and CG assets, in No Internet we shot a plate shot of a street near a small town, and then we added a town welcome sign, which is a completely CG element. We also shot a plate shot of a warehouse and added a CG floating high-tech cube. Both of these elements were completely CG, 3D assets which were created or generated digitally. In the short film Marbles, we added some CG marbles. When you're planning for CG assets to be added, keep in mind that there are at least 2 different costs involved with every VFX shot that has CG elements added to it. First of all, there is the cost of compositing, which is simply adding the CG elements into the shot. Secondly, there's the cost of creating each CG element, or at the very least, finding, purchasing, and licensing pre-built or pre-existing CG elements. If you have multiple CG elements in the same frame or in the same shot, you're going to have multiple expenses to create or generate or find each of those CG elements. There are some websites out there, including one called TurboSquid, where you can find a number of pre-existing CG elements or 3D models that you can then download, license, and use in your projects. One thing to keep in mind when you are looking for pre-existing CG elements in order to save some money, it is the actual building of the 3D model and all of that time and everything that goes into that, which is the hardest part. But once you find a 3D model that will work, that looks like the element that you're looking for, just simply reskinning it or giving it a new texture, what's called a new material, or giving it a new look or different colors, that is a much easier part of the process, and it's pretty straightforward for an experienced VFX artist. For example, in No Internet, for our helicopter shot, our VFX artist found a Coast Guard helicopter that was a really good look for what we're going for the helicopter shot. I obviously wanted the helicopters to look slicker and cooler though, so then he experimented with some nice glossy black textures. He sent me a sample shot of 3 floating teapots to help me see what the material and lighting would look like, and then he applied that texture to the helicopters, giving us this final shot. A CG environment is similar to CG assets or CG elements, except for the fact that it is basically an entire background or entire backdrop or entire world that has been computer generated. It likely consists of hundreds of CG assets and CG elements, if not thousands, of little CG assets everywhere. A CG environment can be used when filming scenes in a magical or futuristic world which doesn't exist. You can use CG environments either in post if you're filming your actor in front of a green screen or blue screen, or you can use the CG environments during production if you're filming your actors in front of an LED wall in what's called a virtual production volume. A CG environment gives you complete control over the lighting, the time of day, and everything else involved in that environment, including the placement of different assets such as rocks or trees, and if you're using a forest environment. I once directed a short film for the Directors Guild of Canada in which we used a completely CG forest environment and shot it in a virtual production volume. By the way, a virtual production volume, or sometimes just simply a volume, is referring to a set that is built using LED walls so that you can film just about any environment that you want as if you're actually there, but do so in a stage or studio. You can also license pre-made or pre-existing CG environments, and depending on where it's from or the detail level, it's going to be anywhere from pretty cheap to really expensive. You can also hire a VFX artist or a team of VFX artists to completely create a brand new CG environment from scratch, but that's also going to be really costly. But if you have a lot of shots that are either in front of an LED wall or in front of a green screen, then using a CG environment rather than a bunch of real-world plate shots is really going to be helpful, even if it is a pretty realistic real-world type set, because using a CG environment gives you much more control over making changes, it gives you much more control over the angle, it gives you much more control over everything about the environment, and it gives you a whole lot more freedom and flexibility when it comes to picking and choosing the right shots and the right angles and matching your green screen shot and angle to what's in the background or vice versa. So if you are planning on using a CG environment, be sure to budget accordingly based on what you're planning and willing to spend as far as either licensing a CG environment or hiring someone to create or add to an existing CG environment. A really simple example of a CG environment would be from the short film Blue that I directed, where we simply replaced the exterior of a couple shots with this dark, windy, scary void. That dark, scary, windy void with the breeze flying by was a completely CG environment. Without getting too technical, rotoscoping is a process in the VFX world which involves isolating a subject or an element from the rest of the frame, or isolating multiple elements from the rest of the frame. Remember, you're shooting in 2 dimensions, and so you only have one layer to work with. Rotoscoping is the process used in order to separate different elements of your frame that you shot into various layers. This gives the VFX artist the ability to then work with those layers and integrate different VFX elements or backgrounds behind or near or around those different elements that they've isolated from the frame. Because rotoscoping is a pretty manual process which requires a lot of work and fine-tuning and a lot of patience, it can also become a very costly process. And so any sort of VFX shot that requires rotoscoping is also usually going to be a little bit more time consuming than other types of VFX work. And so because it's time consuming, it can also be pretty expensive. If you need to replace the background behind an actor, but you did not shoot the actor on a blue screen or green screen, then rotoscoping is most likely going to be required, and that's what the process used to isolate that actor from the rest of the shot so you can then replace the background behind them. So if you're working with a limited budget, try to minimize the amount of rotoscoping required by choosing different shots or altering your shots in some way, or by simply using green screen or blue screen, or by finding some other way to achieve the same look or the same thing or tell the same story. Otherwise, plan accordingly, speak to your VFX artist ahead of time, and work together to come up with a budget for these shots, and definitely expect these shots to take a little bit more time and require a bit more expense than some of your other VFX shots. All of these things so far in and of themselves are relatively straightforward processes as long as the camera is stationary and the objects or the people in the shot are stationary. However, once you introduce any sort of movement, once the camera is moving, or once the object or the person who is being rotoed is moving, then that introduces a new layer of complexity. Tracking is the term that's used when referring to the task of actually tracking that object or that person or the camera's movements through the shot in order to have whatever other VFX elements you're adding or introducing match those movements, and to manipulate those movements so that they match the rest of the scene to make everything look much more realistic. So if you're planning a moving shot with VFX elements, keep in mind that that will likely cost a little bit more than a stationary shot, simply because of the extra time required to do the tracking process and make sure that it looks really good. In marbles, many of our VFX shots were static shots, meaning that they were relatively simple comps. But in No Internet, this shot, where we are moving toward the floating cube, required tracking, and it also required compositing a custom-made CG asset into the shot. This shot in blue is another example of where we used tracking and a little bit of rotoscoping to comp in a CG door. A set extension is where you shoot an actor on a real set, but you digitally replace part of that shot with either another plate shot or a CG environment or CG asset in order to simply extend the size of the set, to make the set look much larger than it really was. If you have rented the exterior of a building for filming a scene, but you would like to see farther down the street and you would like to see the building or your set extend farther down the road that you don't necessarily have access to or control of, then a set extension would allow you then to add a plate shot or a CG world beyond the building where you're filming into now this CG environment that is merged with your real world environment. This would be known as a set extension. In a short film that I did a few years ago, we had a very small set extension in which we actually just extended a path which we physically couldn't do so on the day in real life as we were filming. Here is the original shot taken from a cable cam, and here is the final shot with the added path extension. You can see here that the shot is also moving, meaning that there was tracking involved in this set extension. It is always helpful and preferred to plan out every visual effects shot ahead of time. Share your ideas with your team, make sure everyone is aware of what items are going to be real, which means they require a physical prop or physical object to be present, and which items are going to be added digitally. Make sure everyone knows how you plan on adding those elements digitally. Plan out your shots, plan out the size of your shots, plan out any camera movements and framing ahead of time. Literally count the number of VFX shots and plan that as well. Go over all of these details and plans and thoughts ahead of time with your VFX artists or your VFX producer or whoever is involved and helping you with post-production, and make sure you have a really good idea ahead of time of how much time everyone thinks it will take to achieve these later in post, as well as how much cost will be involved for these shots. And then stick to the plan. Yes, there may be instances where you decide on set or where you need to deviate from the plan a little bit, or maybe you need to add an extra VFX shot, but the more that you deviate from the plan, the more you open yourself up to extra expense or to something not working correctly. Therefore, a thoroughly thought out plan is very essential. I do also discuss some visual effects in some other episodes of Filmmaking for Noobs, and if you're interested, I also have a VFX breakdown of the short film Blue at the end of an earlier episode where I dissected the short film Blue. You can find the link for that episode in the description below. Thanks for watching Filmmaking for Noobs. I hope that you have found this information helpful, and hopefully this gives you a good introduction into the VFX world, and hopefully this has also given you some good information to help you better plan for and prepare for and utilize VFX in your projects. As always, if you found this helpful, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.